Today, I have collated the facts from my colleagues at Doctors for Assange in order to make it clear that we're in an emergency medical situation which needs immediate attention. The exact medical diagnoses are not clear, but there's more than enough evidence to indicate that Julian Assange has been tortured psychologically and is suffering from physical and emotional distress that is being deliberately inflicted. Everyone has the right to health care, and its denial in what is supposedly a civilised Western country is an appalling situation. I'll give a chronology from a medical perspective, and I apologise if this is a bit long. Julian Assange entered the Ecuadorian embassy in London on the 9th of June 2012 and was granted political asylum by the Ecuadorian government. On the 11th of April 2019, he was removed from the embassy and arrested by the British Metropolitan Police. He was subsequently detained in Belmarsh Maximum Security Prison in what the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Professor Nils Melzer, described as, quote, oppressive conditions of isolation and surveillance, unquote. Professor Melzer uses the Istanbul Protocol of 1999 as approved by the UN for the definition of torture. During the 7 years confined in the embassy, Mr. Assange was visited and examined by a number of experts, each of whom expressed alarm at the state of his health and requested that he be allowed access to a hospital. No such access was permitted for 7 years and continuing. I'll just divert for a moment to look at what the British government was doing as the Swedish authorities tried to avoid interviewing Assange, as it would show how non-existent their case was. On the 31st of August 2012, in reference to a news article suggesting that Sweden was considering closing the investigation against Mr. Assange, the British Crown Prosecution Service sent an email to the Swedish prosecutor urging her, "Don't you dare get cold feet," unquote. Note that Julian had only been in the embassy for a few months at this time. The women supposedly making the allegation did not want the prosecution to continue. The Swedish prosecutor did not want to interview Assange, as he and she knew that they had no substantial case, Nils Melzer concluded, commenting, quote, since 2010, the Swedish prosecution appears to do everything to maintain the unqualified rape suspect narrative it has been disseminating, while at the same time avoiding exposing the evidentiary merits of this narrative to transparency and independent public scrutiny, unquote. The clear object of this was to destroy Assange's reputation and public sympathy for him. But 3 years later, on the 31st of July 2015, with him still in the embassy, a dentist reported that Mr. Assange's, quote, upper right premolar tooth had fractured along with the filling and the dental pulp of the tooth was exposed, and that failure to treat this promptly would lead to infection of the root, leading to a dental abscess and pain, unquote. The dentist advised that, quote, saving this tooth could not be done in the embassy setting. There are also considerable potential complications of such an abscess. On the 4th of December 2015, the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, UNGWAD, concluded that Mr. Assange was being arbitrarily detained by the governments of the UK and Sweden. Crucially, it was made clear at that time that, quote, after 5 years of deprivation of liberty, Mr. Assange's health could have deteriorated to such a level that anything more than a superficial illness would put his health at a serious risk, and he was denied access to a medical institution for proper diagnosis, including a magnetic resonance imaging test, unquote. On the 8th of December 2015, a doctor who saw Mr. Assange reported, quote, progressive inflammation and stiffness affecting his right shoulder. This requires an MRI scan to determine the exact diagnosis. He was refused access to a hospital by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. On the 11th of December 2015, a medical trauma and psychosocial expert reported, quote, Mr. Assange scored 15 out of 20 on the Patient Health Questionnaire, a multi-purpose instrument for screening, diagnosing, monitoring and measuring the severity of depression. A score of 15 indicates that Mr. Assange suffers from major depression. At a minimum, it is recommended that his urgent medical complaints regarding the pain in his shoulder be investigated with appropriate equipment. The only way Mr. Assange can access either urgent medical care or investigations would be to place himself in the hands of the British authorities.
His inability to access proper medical care and assessment without placing himself in the hands of the authorities transforms each physical complaint, no matter how simple, into something that could have catastrophic consequences either for his health or his liberty." Unquote. In 2017, Drs. Sondra Crosby, Brock Chisholm and Sean Love visited Mr. Assange and examined him for 20 hours over 3 days. They concluded, quote, "He badly needs care, but he can't get it. We call on the British Medical Association and colleagues in the UK to demand safe access to medical care for Mr. Assange and to oppose openly the ongoing violations of his human right to healthcare." Unquote. On the 22nd of December 2018, Dr. Sean Love, who had visited the embassy several times, reiterated his concerns in the British Medical Journal. Quote, "Assange's detention continues to cause a precipitous deterioration in his overall condition, and that because of his health issues in 2015, Ecuadorian authorities requested that he be permitted humanitarian safe passage to a hospital in London. However, this was denied by the UK." Unquote. Dr. Love stated, quote, "He has gone without proper access to care for the duration of his 6 years in confinement." Unquote. On the 21st of December 2018, the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention issued a further statement opposing the continued unlawful detention of Mr. Assange. It added, "We are further concerned that the modalities of the continued arbitrary deprivation of liberty of Mr. Assange is undermining his health and may possibly endanger his life, given the disproportionate amount of anxiety and stress that such prolonged deprivation of liberty entails." On the 5th of April 2019, Professor Nils Melzer issued a statement following reports that Mr. Assange may soon be expelled from the Ecuadorian embassy. He said, quote, "Mr. Assange is at risk of extreme vulnerability and his health is in serious decline. I therefore appeal to the Ecuadorian authorities to continue to provide him, to the fullest extent possible in the circumstances, with adequate living conditions and access to appropriate medical care." Unquote. Despite this plea, on the 11th of April 2019, Mr. Assange was expelled from the embassy and arrested by the Metropolitan Police. On May the 1st, 2019, Mr. Assange was described as suffering from moderate to severe depression at a hearing in the Southwark Crown Court, at which he was sentenced to 50 weeks imprisonment for a bail infringement dating back to 2012, 7 years before. On May the 3rd, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention issued a statement noting it was deeply concerned over Assange's 50 weeks imprisonment. Quote, "The working group regrets that the government has not complied with its opinion and has now furthered the arbitrary deprivation of liberty of Mr. Assange." Unquote. On the 9th of May 2019, Professor Melzer visited Belmarsh Prison accompanied by 2 medical experts with special expertise in assessing victims of torture. On the 23rd of May, the US government brought charges under the Espionage Act of 1917 against Mr. Assange for his publishing activities on behalf of WikiLeaks. On the 29th of May, Mr. Assange was moved to the hospital wing at Belmarsh Prison following a reported significant deterioration in his health. On the 30th of May, Mr. Assange was too unwell to appear in court even via video link for a preliminary extradition hearing. It should be noted that the medical facilities and staffing at Belmarsh Prison Hospital Wing have never been divulged to the public. On the 31st of May, the UN Special Rapporteur, Nils Melzer, reported on his 9th of May visit, quote, "We all came to the conclusion that he showed all the symptoms that are typical for a person that has been exposed to psychological torture over an extended period of time." On the 22nd of October, Craig Murray, a former British ambassador, published a detailed and shocking eyewitness account of Mr. Assange's hearing the previous day, stating that he, quote, "exhibited exactly the symptoms of a torture victim." Unquote. His report was corroborated by the eyewitness account of John Pilger, the renowned investigative journalist and filmmaker. On the 1st of November 2019, Professor Melzer reiterated his alarm at the continuing deterioration of Assange's health since his arrest and detention earlier this year, saying his life was now at risk. Mr. Melzer said, quote, "What we have seen from the UK government is outright contempt for Mr. Assange's rights and integrity, and despite the medical urgency of my appeal and the seriousness of the alleged violations, the UK has not taken any measures of investigation, prevention and redress required under international law." Professor Melzer concluded, quote, "Unless the US changes course urgently and alleviates his inhumane situation, Mr. Assange's continued exposure to arbitrariness and abuse may soon end up costing his life." Medical doctors have a professional duty to report suspected torture of which they become aware, wherever it may be occurring. We wish to put on record as medical doctors our collective serious concerns and to draw attention to the public and the world of this serious situation. The World Health Organization Constitution of 1946 envisages, quote, the highest attainable standard of health as a fundamental right of every human being. We are indebted to those who have sought to uphold this right in the case of Mr. Assange. From a medical point of view, on the evidence currently available, we have serious concerns about Mr. Assange's fitness to stand trial in February 2020. Most importantly, it's our opinion Mr. Assange requires urgent expert medical assessment of both his physical and psychological state of health. Any medical treatment indicated should be administered in a properly equipped and expertly staffed university teaching hospital. If such urgent assessment and treatment does not take place, we have real concerns on the evidence currently available that Mr. Assange could die in prison. The medical situation is thereby urgent. There is no time to lose. It might also be noted that in his current psychological condition, Julian Assange is not well enough to stand trial. He needs proper medical assessment and treatment before a trial should even be attempted. The scheduling of his trial in February is a further abuse of the legal process. To quote further from Professor Nils Melzer's report, Read a Visit to Belmarsh Prison of the 9th of May 2019, quote, it was obvious that Mr. Assange's health has been seriously affected by the extremely hostile and arbitrary environment that he has been exposed to for many years. Most importantly, in addition to his physical ailments, Mr. Assange showed all symptoms typical for prolonged exposure to psychological torture, including extreme stress, chronic anxiety, and intense psychological trauma. In 20 years of work with victims of war, violence, and political persecution, I have never seen a group of democratic states ganging up to deliberately isolate, demonize, and abuse a single individual for such a long time and with so little regard for human dignity and the rule of law.
Doctors for Assange entirely agree with the statements and assessments of Professor Nils Melzer and his team. We demand that he receive the health care that he is entitled to and that the psychological torture be stopped immediately. The use of trumped-up charges to hold him, the systematic character assassination and the abuse of legal process must stop. The immoral conduct of the UK, Swedish and US governments demands the strongest condemnation and the boorish indifference of the Australian government the same. Thanks very much.